Margaret Hale was 22 years old when they left her to die in the high country above Copper Ridge. She had no horse, no food, no shelter, no map. All she had was an old wool coat, a small folding knife that had belonged to her grandfather, and $11 hidden inside the lining of her boot. The men who abandoned her believed she would never make it back. They were wrong, because a few hours east of where they left her, beyond a ridge that appeared on no local map, there was an old cabin waiting in a forgotten valley, and inside that cabin was something that would change Margaret Hale's life forever. But to understand how she ended up there, you have to understand the life she had before the mountains took everything from her. Margaret had been born in a small mill town called Beeler's Crossing. Her father, Samuel Hale, worked repairing machinery at the local mill. Her mother, Alice, earned a living doing laundry for families in town. For the first 9 years of Margaret's life, they had very little money, but they had something that mattered more. They had each other. Then Samuel died during a harsh winter fever that swept through the mill workers. 18 months later, Margaret lost her mother too. At 9 years old, she was sent across the valley to live with her grandfather, Ibrahim Hale. Ibrahim was 63 at the time. He was a quiet man, a widower, and a former Army scout who had spent years traveling through rough mountain country. He wasn't good at comforting a frightened child. He didn't know how to say the things other grandfathers said. Instead, he taught Margaret how to survive. He taught her how to read the weather by watching the leaves of the aspen trees, how to walk across loose rock without losing her footing, how to find dry wood inside a wet branch, how to follow animal tracks, how to pack a mule, how to find her way home when there was no road to follow. When she was 12, he taught her to shoot. When she was 14, he taught her how to maintain a rifle and reload cartridges. By 16, Margaret could travel through the mountain country better than most grown men who had lived there their entire lives. But of everything her grandfather taught her, there was one lesson she remembered most. On her 17th birthday, Ibrahim gave her a small folding knife. It had a worn bone handle, polished smooth by years of use. He placed it in her hand and said, "Big things aren't always what keep you alive. Sometimes it's knowing what to do with the little things you have." Margaret carried that knife every day afterward. She never imagined how important it would become. Ibrahim died quietly when Margaret was 20. His small mountain property passed to his younger brother, Walter Hale. Walter lived far away and barely knew Margaret. A few weeks after the funeral, a letter arrived. The land had been sold. The cabin would have to be emptied before the end of August. Margaret was allowed to keep her personal belongings. She was not entitled to any part of the money from the sale. She read the letter twice. Then she folded it carefully and placed it inside an old tin box. After that, she went outside and fed the chickens, because the chickens still needed feeding, even when a person's entire life was falling apart. Near the end of August, a land agent named Calvin Brooks rode up the valley. He carried the sale papers in a leather case. He politely explained what Margaret could take and what she had to leave behind. Her grandfather's old rifle was considered part of the property. The 2 cows were part of the property. The mule was part of the property. Even the bed frame belonged to the new owner. Margaret was allowed to keep her mother's Bible, her clothes, the tin box, 1 blanket, an iron cooking pan, the folding knife, and a small brass compass that had belonged to her grandfather. She packed everything into the same kind of cloth bag she had arrived with 13 years earlier. There was one other thing she had: $11. Her grandfather had kept the money in a coffee tin. Nobody had asked about it, so Margaret slipped the bills and coins into the lining of her boot. It was all she had. The next morning she walked down toward Copper Ridge. Copper Ridge was a dusty little mountain town. There was one main street, a livery stable, a small hotel, a general store, and a few rough wooden buildings scattered along the road. Margaret looked for work. She asked at the boarding house. Nothing. She asked at the freight office. Nothing. At a small hotel run by a woman named Mrs. Doyle, she was told there was no room for another worker. That night, Margaret slept behind the livery stable. The stable hand let her use an empty stall for a few cents. She ate a piece of bread and some dried meat. Then she lay awake thinking about her grandfather, about the cabin, about the mountains, and about the possibility that she might never have a home again. The following morning she heard that a group of 4 hunters from the east was preparing an expedition into the high country. They needed someone who knew the mountain trails. Margaret went straight to them. Their leader was a broad-shouldered man named Richard Cole. He looked at Margaret with the kind of suspicion women traveling alone often received in those days. She told him what she could do: cook, pack horses, dress game, read mountain trails, find water, survive in rough country. Richard asked who had taught her. "My grandfather," she said. "Who was he?" "Ibrahim Hale." Richard paused. He knew the name. Then he offered her $4 for the trip, meals included. Margaret accepted. She didn't bargain. $4 was $4, and the mountains were the closest thing she had left to home. The group rode out the following morning. 5 riders, several horses, pack animals loaded with supplies. Margaret stayed near the back. For the first 2 days, the trail climbed steadily through pine and fir forests. By the 3rd day, the trees became thinner. The mountains opened into wide fields of grass and rock. The men rarely spoke to Margaret. They asked when dinner would be ready, whether the horses were secure, whether she had enough firewood. She did everything they asked, but she noticed something. The men were often whispering among themselves. On the 4th morning, Richard handed her a rough hand-drawn map. "Ride ahead and check that drainage," he said. Margaret did. She rode alone for nearly 2 hours. The drainage was empty. No sheep, no fresh tracks, no sign of anything worth hunting. She turned her horse around, and that's when she saw it. The camp was gone. The horses were gone. The men were gone. Her belongings were gone. Only tracks remained, and every track led down the mountain. Margaret sat completely still. She understood immediately. They had abandoned her. Maybe they wanted to hide something. Maybe they thought nobody would care if a young woman disappeared in the mountains. Whatever the reason, Margaret knew one thing: following them would be a mistake. So she turned east, toward country she remembered from childhood. By evening, her horse went lame. Margaret removed the saddle and bridle. She gave the animal a final look, then let it go. She continued on foot. She walked through the night. At sunrise, she rested beneath a fallen pine. Then she kept walking. By the following afternoon, she found a narrow trail. It led into a ravine she had never seen on any map. At the bottom was a clear spring. Beside it stood a small wooden cabin. Margaret stopped. She couldn't believe her eyes. The cabin looked abandoned. The roof was old. The logs had turned silver with age. A small 5-pointed star had been carved above the door. The door stood partly open. Margaret stepped inside. There was a stone fireplace, an iron stove, a wooden table, a simple bed frame, a few tin plates, a whetstone, some old rope, and on a shelf sat a leather-bound ledger. Margaret first built a fire. Then she drank water from the spring. Only after she had warmed herself did she open the ledger. The first page was dated 1867. It had been written by a man named Nathaniel Reed. Nathaniel had built the cabin himself. He had lived there for nearly 20 years. He trapped animals, hunted elk, cut his own firewood. He wrote about storms, winters, loneliness, and a dog he had once owned. But near the end of the ledger, his writing changed. He wrote that his health was failing, that he did not expect to survive another spring, and that there was something hidden in the cabin, something he wanted a decent person in need to find. Margaret turned to the final pages. Behind the last page, sewn into the binding, was a folded piece of oilcloth. She carefully cut the thread with her grandfather's knife. Inside were 3 things: a hand-drawn map, a sealed letter, and an old military inventory. The map showed the cabin, and beneath the fireplace was marked with a small X. Margaret stared at it. Then she walked to the hearth. The stones around the fireplace were old, but one section looked slightly different. Margaret knelt down. Using the tip of her knife, she carefully worked the mortar loose. One stone came free, then another. Beneath them was a wooden cover. She lifted it. There was a metal-lined box. Inside were several cloth bags. Margaret opened the first. Gold coins spilled onto the floor. She opened another. Silver coins. Then she found old paper money, military documents, a faded army map, and a small brass compass. Margaret picked up the compass. Her hands began to shake. On the back were 2 initials, I.H., and beneath them, 1863, her grandfather. For a long moment, Margaret simply stared at it. How had her grandfather's compass ended up inside a forgotten cabin deep in the mountains? She returned everything to the box. She didn't spend any of the money. Not yet. When you don't understand something, you don't rush. You wait. You observe. You think. The next morning, Margaret cleaned the cabin. She repaired the door, patched the walls, cleaned the stove, fixed the bed, stacked firewood. She made the abandoned cabin livable again. Then, 6 days later, she walked back to Copper Ridge carrying 4 gold coins. She went directly to the marshal. His name was Thomas Gray. Margaret told him everything. She told him about the hunting party, the abandoned camp, the missing supplies, the men who had left her behind. Thomas listened carefully. He already suspected Richard Cole and his men were involved in something more than hunting. Within days, Richard and 2 of his companions were arrested. Margaret's belongings were recovered: her mother's Bible, her tin box, her clothes, her cooking pan. Everything came back to her. But Margaret had something else now, a place of her own. She went to the land office. The ravine wasn't registered under anyone's name, so she filed a claim. Then she used one of the gold coins to buy flour, salt, coffee, blankets, matches, an axe, and a used rifle. A local freight driver helped her get a mule and a horse. A blacksmith who had known her grandfather refused to charge her the full price. An older woman in town gave her 2 dresses. People who had once walked past Margaret without noticing her began helping her, not because she begged, but because she had survived. Before the first major snow, Margaret returned to the cabin. This time she had supplies: a horse, a mule, a rifle, and a future. She cleared the land, built a small shelter for the animals, stacked firewood, planted a small garden near the spring, and began guiding hunters through the mountains. She charged $4 a day, the exact amount Richard Cole had once offered her. Only now she was the one setting the price. Over the years, her reputation grew. Hunters came looking for Margaret Hale. Travelers asked for her by name. People in Copper Ridge began to respect her knowledge of the country. The girl who had once been treated like she didn't belong anywhere had become one of the most trusted guides in the region. Eventually, the government approved her claim. The land officially became hers. The forgotten cabin became her home, and the ravine became known around Copper Ridge as Hale Valley. Years later, on a quiet winter evening, Margaret sat alone beside the stove. A kerosene lamp burned on the table. In front of her lay two objects, her grandfather's folding knife and the old brass compass. She opened Nathaniel Reed's letter again. He explained everything. During the Civil War, Nathaniel had served as a military clerk. In 1864, he had been ordered to hide a supply of army money and equipment in the mountains. The war ended. No one ever returned for it. Nathaniel decided the safest thing was to leave it hidden. Over the years, he added some of his own savings. He had no wife, no children, no close family, so he left everything to whoever might eventually find the cabin, someone who needed a second chance. And then came the part that mattered most. Nathaniel had been given Margaret's grandfather's compass during a military crossing. Her grandfather never came back for it. Nathaniel kept it for decades. He never found its owner, so he left it behind, never knowing that one day it would return to the man's granddaughter. Margaret returned the letter back inside the ledger. Then she looked at the knife and the compass, two small objects, two pieces of another time. Both had traveled through years of war, loneliness, and loss before finally reaching her. Her grandfather had taught her how to survive. Nathaniel unknowingly left her the means to begin again. Neither man had ever known Margaret would exist, yet both had helped shape the life she eventually built. The men who left Margaret on that mountain thought they were abandoning a helpless young woman. They thought she had no family, no money, no witnesses, no way home. They were wrong. They had only pushed her toward a place where her future had been waiting for decades, a place beyond the map, a cabin hidden in a forgotten valley, a fortune saved by a stranger, a compass that belonged to her grandfather, and a chance to build something that no one could take away from her. Margaret Hale started with $11, an old coat, and a folding knife. Years later, she had land, a home, a business, a reputation, and most importantly, a life that belonged entirely to her. Sometimes the road you lose is not the end of your story. Sometimes it is the beginning of a road you were never supposed to find. And sometimes when one door closes behind you, there is another waiting somewhere beyond the map. You just have to keep walking long enough to find it.